Greetings, Baker aka Imacuttlefish here, and on this date, 'tis mine intent to impress upon thee my view on this most remarkable dramatis personae from a highly renowned and laureled interactional narrative, the 14th iteration within the exquisite Final Fantasy concatenation. Ere we begin, hark thee to my words. Thou mayest watch this video only in the event that thou hast glimpsed all that there is to see within this narrative, lest it be ruined forever for thee. Now, when we talk about Urianger, something worth noting is that he was the first original character that Naoki Yoshida's team created when he took over in 1.0. Mr. Yoshida has stated many times in interviews that he is particularly fond of Urianger for this very reason, due to him having come this far and still remaining an iconic character within FF14. Indeed, when he was asked about his favorite scenes in the case of both Shadowbringers and Endwalker, he mentioned scenes where Urianger played a prominent role. Now, I'm not saying this to imply that, oh, because the director-producer of the game likes this character the most that you should too. Rather, the fact that even after all these incredible characters that have been introduced over the years, that the man is still so fond of his first creation is quite wholesome in my eyes. It's something you tend to see from time to time. To provide another example, Nomura is quite fond of Setzer from Final Fantasy VI, the first character he got to fully create by himself, and he has had him appear in quite a few of his games. So Mr. Yoshida viewing Urianger as kind of a golden child? Yeah, it's quite understandable. Urianger, as mentioned earlier, is a legacy character, but just like Estinian, his involvement in 1.0 isn't too important. He sort of just shows up to cryptically talk about this coming doom and then farts out a dino to attack the player. Kind of a shame he would lose that ability come A Realm Reborn. When it comes to Urianger, we can basically talk about Urianger post-Shadowbringers and pre-Shadowbringers. Prior to Shadowbringers, if I am to be blunt, he wasn't a particularly interesting character. He was this kind of a riddle guy specializing in prophecies in place of Luizua, so he did have a certain ominous aura around him, and he does also have a few nice moments, such as when he shows up to fight the Warriors of Darkness in 3.4, or when he gives Analysing the rapier in 4.0. But on the aggregate, he was mainly just this guy who would sometimes show up to either give exposition, or hand out some manner of plot device that allows you to defeat the bad guy, like the White Aura side in 3.0 or the Ether Disruptor thingy in 4.0, as well as the NPC handling the EX Trials and Bahamut in A Realm Reborn. But as far as any kind of depth or flavor, there wasn't much to Urianger back then. Like Alphino, Urianger is a character that benefits from FF14's MMO story structure in how he develops over a very long term of about 8 years if we go with real time. But unlike Alphino, who grew consistently over the expansions, Urianger has these small seeds set up that the writers just leave chilling in the background until Shadowbringers and Endwalker, which is when they take full advantage of those seeds, and that's when we see Urianger's characters truly flourish. And this is exactly why I make that distinction of Urianger prior to and after Shadowbringers, because Shadowbringers was that cutoff point where the writers started to really dig deep into his character and have him develop, at which point he becomes almost a different character entirely, one that we can really connect with, which I suppose is the point of a change arc. So I won't be spending as much time talking about Urianger before Shadowbringers as I normally do with other characters in these videos, as I really don't feel there is much interesting conversation to be had there. This is of course with the major exception of those important setups I mentioned, one in A Realm Reborn and one in Heavensward, that changed Urianger's life quite significantly. So let's discuss these two events. The first thing we need to talk about is Moenbryda and her subsequent death. This was a death scene that didn't click with everyone. The main reason being given is that she simply wasn't around for long enough to have a strong enough connection to her by the time she died. It's worth noting that there's an additional layer here, which is that to some it was sorta disappointing how we finally had actual Rogaden representation in the main cast, a femro no less, which has long been the least played race/gender combo, only to have her die in basically the same patch that she was introduced in. To add salt to that wound, sometime before patch 2.5, Mr. Yoshida mentioned in a Q&A when asked if there will be femrows implemented in the MSQ that they have something planned, obviously referring to Moenbryda. So for people who truly wanted that femro representation, it's understandable it might have been in poor taste to have her killed so quickly, as it could easily come across, "See, we don't want your stupid Rogadens in our story," even if that obviously never was the intent of the developers. My opinion regarding Moenbryda is that I don't think it was some sort of failure or lack of foresight by the developers, but rather, on the contrary, that they chose to do it this way very much deliberately. You have to remember that at this point in time, we weren't anywhere near as invested in the Scions, as a lot of A Realm Reborn was dedicated to building up the world, establishing the setting, the rules, basically a lot of foundational work, and thus we didn't have as much time to properly bond with the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, who were supposed to be our main party members essentially. But you kinda needed that connection in order for the banquet scene to work, and Moenbryda was really their key to accomplishing this. While the Scions were generally something that you could describe as friends within a work environment, with Moenbryda you had a character that was much more flavorful. She was fun, she had her quirks, she was quite grounded compared to the Scions in terms of her backstory and aspirations. In the short amount of time that we got to bond with her, she didn't grow on us enough to make her some de facto S-tier character, but rather she grew on us just enough that hopefully, when she did make her sacrifice, you cared at least somewhat and felt it at least a little bit. Though obviously for some it did far more than that, but yeah, her death was tragic precisely because our time with her was so short-lived. It managed to hit that perfect sweet spot of having us spend just enough time with her to get us to care and no more than that. The reason it was done this way was because this death wasn't set up for us to mourn Moenbryda specifically, but it was more to connect us closer to the Scions. This is someone most of them had known since childhood, a very close friend, and we really see how her death shook them. It serves to humanize the Scions and have us grow closer to them. Additionally, it serves to raise the stakes, i.e. give us a death of a more important character so we know and understand that, oh shit, characters can actually die in this game, and of course make the Ascians a bit more intimidating, as our first Ascian kill came at a heavy cost. What I'm describing there are the narrative short-term effects of Moenbryda's death, but there was also a more long-term consequence, the cherry on top if you will, with how this death scene was later on used to flesh out Urianger's character. I say it's a cherry on top because I am not sure if his development in Shadowbringers and Endwalker was penned all the way back then, as the devs have admitted that there have been many things during A Realm Reborn and Heavensward where they hadn't thought of the payoffs that we would see later. However, I personally choose to believe that in the case of Urianger and Moenbryda, it was made with that intent in mind, because this death scene would come to really shape his character later down the line, and you generally don't just wing that kind of stuff. The groundwork has to be laid somewhere. What I mean to say here is that the goal of Moenbryda's death wasn't just to make you feel sad towards the situation. In fact, I would argue that wasn't even the primary reason, but rather it had multiple reasons in the background. So do try to keep that in mind when you think about her character, as this scene will be relevant later on in the video. The other event I refer to is when he conspires with the Ascians and the Warriors of Darkness, and we have that whole 3.4 scenario happen, which I see BA to recite all of it here because I'm sure most of you remember at least roughly what happened, and I have also talked about it in 2 separate videos previously. But the important thing is that through trading with the Ascians, he finds out about the existence of other shards and the state of the first, and orchestrates that whole thing, which results in Minfilia being sent to the first as the Oracle of Light. As he himself put it, he bargained one life for one world, with Minfilia being the chip, and the guilt from this decision plays an important role in his character later down the line. Both Moenbryda's death and this are the 2 things I referred to at the beginning of the video. They are sort of just left in the background. They aren't really brought up that many times, if at all. Urianger doesn't seem to stop to reflect on these events aside from right after they happened. It makes us see Urianger as kind of a one-dimensional character who doesn't really get shaped by things happening around him. as he continues to be basically the same as he was before these significant events. But then Shadowbringers comes around and shatters this view of Urianger with a bloody hammer. Seriously, I can't emphasize enough how this was such an outstanding case of subverting expectations. I remember finishing Shadowbringers and finding myself actually bamboozled at how great Urianger was in that story. How was this done? Let's discuss it here. Now that it's all said and done, most people will remember Urianger most fondly from Endwalker, as that's where the big Moenbryda payoff finally comes in. But I would say that to me, his development in Shadowbringers was no less crucial than what he got in Endwalker. So let's discuss some of that. Before we get to talking about Urianger's story in Shadowbringers, I wanna show some appreciation to Ayumi Namae, the concept artist behind quite a few of the Shadowbringers outfits, including Urianger's. Obviously, Urianger doesn't have quite as an in-depth story behind his outfit as, say, Alphino or Estinian, but I nonetheless believe that Urianger's new outfit was huge for his character. What makes this outfit stand out is that it's a mage outfit that really nails a great balance between that dainty female Astro look and still making a male character like Urianger look amazing in it. You don't often see adult male characters in robes in Final Fantasy, so I must commend Miss Namae for making Urianger look like such a Chad despite being a mage wearing a robe. I mean, let's be real, when you see Urianger in Shadowbringers is one of those moments where you see straight dudes turn gay. Believe me, I speak from experience. Also, since he had been wearing a mask for the entirety of the game up until this point, barring the Warriors of Darkness questline, we feel much more personally attached to him now that he's speaking freely without the cowl, which of course comes into play symbolically throughout Shadowbringers as he becomes more open with his thoughts. Then we also have the job they chose to have Urianger switch to. Having him go from an arcanist to an astro was such a brilliant move. Astrology obviously deals with fate, which ties with Urianger's roots of being Luizua's successor in dealing with prophecies and such, something that they tapped into quite well in the Shadowbringers trailer. This started him on a journey towards becoming that eccentric yet competent astro that we now know and love. The reason I am drawing attention to these visual changes is that it's the crucial first step Urianger takes towards becoming that cool mage. When we first meet Urianger, they initially play the character by the books by having him be the one who gives us our second major lore reveal of the expansion, which is to be expected as he has been there for 3 years already, giving him plenty of time to make such discoveries. And indeed, I like the fact that he has already managed to befriend the pixies and have this abode full of books, some of which he probably wrote himself. This kind of a discovery is to be expected from Urianger, seeing as part of his shtick is the whole big brain mage thing. It all gives you a sense of familiarity to the character, but they also display some all new aspects of the character that we see right off the bat. When we get to have a one-on-one chat with him, he opens up a bit and tells us that though he feels he would naturally be inclined to help save it regardless, he feels extra compelled to save the first, seeing as it was through his guidance that the Warriors of Darkness and Minfilia were brought together, sent to the first, and sacrificed their lives to halt the flood of light. This is some good foreshadowing for later on when we find out just how much the events of 3.4 have really been on his mind. Now, something the writers did with Urianger in the transition to Shadowbringers was to tone down both the ominous aspect of his character as well as his theatrical way of speech, or the way he would speak in riddles if you were playing the other translations. This was done in response to some players expressing that they legitimately have trouble understanding the character and what they are saying. Another issue with Urianger was the fact that he was a character that was kind of hard to relate to. Not only does he wear a mask and always act in shady/questionable ways, even when he does do something big like in 3.4, it's so out there and almost kind of absurd in how big-brained that plan was that it makes it really hard to connect to him. What the writers did then in Shadowbringers was react to this feedback by baking it into his character growth. It could have been so easy for them to simply patch Urianger, so to speak, so that in the next MSQ patch His speech and mannerisms would have been changed to please the players, asking for him to be easier to understand. And indeed, that's probably what most developers would have done. But in FF14, the devs saw an opportunity to have Urianger undergo some much needed character development, and so they went for it. He undergoes this slow transformation from being sort of a nerdy shut-in to growing closer to his friends, and in the process, he slowly lessens his snobby theatrical way of speech to the point that he becomes much more comprehensible. This growth happens during the Tancred/Rean/Urianger story arc that is going on throughout the first half of Shadowbringers, as well as during the Eden storyline. This storyline is of course memorable for both the transformation of Tancred and Rean, but what some people may forget at times is that Urianger grew quite a lot as a result of this dynamic too, and was actually rather important in helping Rean and Tancred to grow closer. In this particular dynamic, Urianger acts as an extra parent figure to Rean, almost like a cool uncle of sorts. We see this right off the bat with the first interaction we see between these two characters, where Urianger implores Rean to pick a book amongst his selection, something that makes her exceedingly happy since she isn't used to having this much liberty in making decisions, foreshadowing her eventually becoming more free-willed after the Amareng arc. Though it's mostly subtle and sometimes off-screen even, Urianger is actually teaching Rean a lot even before that pep talk scene in Amareng. For example, in Raktika, while he was tending to Rean's wounds, he spoke to her quite a bit about Tancred. Perhaps this was helpful in giving Rean some confidence while Tancred was still projecting. In Amareng, Urianger tries to mend the relationship between Tancred and Rean by trying to talk to Tancred when he sees that his friend is hurting over this situation. Though he had good intentions, Urianger's words only really serve to irritate Tancred more than anything, since Tancred sees Urianger's approach as that snobby, holier-than-thou type of a thing. When Rean very nearly has a meltdown, Urianger approaches her and gives her one of the best pep talks from the entire game. Seriously, this scene is awesome. We then see in the following scene Rean showing appreciation to Urianger for his encouraging words, and we further see the admiration and respect she has towards Urianger in the Eden raids, where she counts Urianger as one of the individuals that helped shape her to the person she would become, and she also seems to have been paying attention to Urianger's lessons and kinda takes after his desire for knowledge. Though it's in Savage and technically not canon, I do appreciate that in the Savage version of Fatebreaker, you also see Urianger represented through the card mechanics, meaning this fight born out of Rean's memories did also feature Urianger, technically speaking of course. I have a certain fondness for all those wholesome interactions between Urianger and Rean, and shall I say it was quite an underrated part of Shadowbringers. If anything, I wish we could have gotten to see a bit more of those two, but then that entire storyline would have taken even more space from the Shadowbringers story than it already did. Shadowbringers also sets the stage for the dynamic between Tancred and Urianger, which we see further explored in the Eden raids and Endwalker MSQ. I actually really like these two and their antiques when they are on screen together. You got the suave rogue and the eccentric Astro. I mean, damn, with a duo like that, scenes practically write themselves. They both also have a strong connection to three particular people, which strengthens their bond. They share a mentor, Luizua, whom they both looked up to. Minfilia, who was a sister in spirit to Tancred, and for Urianger, he felt bad about the hand he dealt her. And of course Rean, where both Tancred and Urianger acted as role models. We can also see how Tancred must feel a lot of appreciation to Urianger for his assistance in helping him be closer to Rean, even if we never see them exchange dialogue that would directly indicate this. On top of that, I like how their camaraderie is demonstrated not just through their interactions out of combat, but also in combat. Not only is there a little gameplay element where Urianger replaces Rean as the one who imbues Tancred's cartridges in trust dungeons, but we also see these two working together in cutscenes in a few action scenes. At least, these two come to mind.
Urianger! At once! Down with you!
I find this to be pretty badass, since we can infer that these two either practice these sorts of synergistic attacks off screen, or that they are just really good at improvising, so they basically have a psychic link. Either way, it's cool. Another great Urianger scene from Shadowbringers is the one shortly after Mount Gulg, where he feels ashamed and guilt over the way he baited the warrior flight and the others with the Grahatia sex threat. Even though he accepted that the warrior flight might be upset after his lie was discovered, he nonetheless feels genuine anguish over the situation. I love how relatable this is, as lying often does feel quite shitty, regardless of the color of the lie. No wonder he feels so humbled here. This then gets further elaborated on in Endwalker. After following him around a bit on the moon, we have a one-on-one conversation with him, a rather intimate one too. Urianger essentially comes fully clean about having to have lied and act in secrecy in the past, lamenting the fact that he always ended up in that role. Alright, let's dive a bit deeper into Urianger's personality here. One of the most important scenes in understanding who Urianger is the scene where he talks to Reen in Amareng.
None of this is thy doing, child. 'Twas I who set the oracle on her path unto the first. I who condemned you all to suffer these torments. 'Tis my sin alone, and one that will haunt me unto my dying day. Yet I dare not dwell overlong on my many regrets, for the world is a tapestry of fates, interwoven and inseparable. And we who strive to better it cannot choose but make difficult decisions. For naught of worth was ever achieved without sacrifice. And thus must man ever struggle to weigh life against loss. The one for whom thou mournest beareth no grudge. Were she here, she would not suffer thee to languish in sorrow. She would tell thee to seek thine own path, thine own purpose. It is a truth which I myself was slow to learn. Yet a truth it remaineth. Thou needst but have faith, and all will be well.
When we take the context of his childhood into account, it's easy to see why Urianger was the type of a person he was throughout A Realm Reborn, Heavensward and Stormblood. He was always kind of a lone kid, and so he never was that good with crowds and such, which resulted in him developing that strange personality he has going on. But in Shadowbringers he realizes that it's not good enough when he has friends that need emotional support from him, and indeed we see in his interaction with Tancred that it simply isn't working out. He needs to speak more openly and freely, so he kinda just goes for it in this scene with Reen. He tells her his story bit by bit, and it's the first time we see Urianger speak so directly, intimately, and sharing his thoughts outward so openly. In addition, this is where we find out that Urianger's woes have been quite psychological in nature all this time, as we realize that what he did to Minfilia has been weighing on his mind all this time and has been causing mental distress, something that we never realized since this is the first time he found a moment to talk about it. This was basically the moment that made me love Urianger, because with this single stroke they turned him from a distant, hard to approach NPC to a very humane character. How often does it happen where something drastic happens and you mull over the event internally for days, weeks, months, maybe even years, without ever approaching someone else about it? Also, I just love the humility it brings to Urianger's character. We see his flaws brought to the forefront here, especially the bit where he admits that it took him a long time to stop feeling guilt over the events of 3.4. Through Urianger's dialogue, this scene also gives us quite a lot of insight into the inner workings of Urianger's character, as in how he thinks and his worldviews. One thing we can observe is the way he views regret. Urianger here regards regret as something that is generally a waste of time, that having to make tough decisions is a regular part of life. However, true to Urianger's character, there is a hint of deceit here. Well, not exactly deception, but he's more giving Reen a half-truth than anything. While it is true that this is how he thinks, he is omitting the fact that in reality, he struggles quite a lot with regret himself, which is something we find out especially in Endwalker. In the private convo on the moon, he conveys how he sometimes struggles to live according to his worldviews, since he sometimes feels the temptation to regret things, such as him being unable to save Moenbryda. So when he was telling Reen to not drown in regret, he was really wearing a mask, and it's this scene where we get to see how Urianger truly copes with these situations he went through. I like this portrayal because it is true that regret and guilt often walk hand in hand, and someone like Urianger, who had to go through some seriously traumatic events, like being involved in multiple plans that resulted or would have resulted in people sacrificing themselves, it makes a lot of sense that someone in his situation would be struggling to come to terms with his choices. This then comes full circle in Ultima Thule, where he finally admits this to the entire group.
My resolve hath never been as strong as thine. Full oft have I wavered in my decisions, and afterwards been stricken with regret.
That one-on-one convo on the moon is important because it's when we get even further reaffirmed that his inability to save Moenbryda, him orchestrating Minfilia being sent to the First as the Oracle of Light, as well as him going along with Grahatia's sacrifice place so readily without thinking of alternatives, all these things have been weighing heavily on his conscience despite what he lets on. We come to understand that Urianger, despite the appearance he puts on of being this big brain Astro and his ability to talk softly and smoothly, is actually quite a fallible person whose woes are rooted in these deep psychological scars, more so than most people would probably even realize. And if not for the interactions he had with Reen, Tancred and the Warrior of Light throughout Shadowbringers and Endwalker, it's entirely possible that over time, these thoughts of guilt and regret would have kept gnawing at him more and more until he would have collapsed under all that mental distress. And indeed, one could argue that Urianger actually was depressed throughout the story. I am no psychologist, of course, but I am pretty sure that the level at which Urianger is experiencing regret is a clear characteristic of depression. But then, characters dealing with depression and trauma seems to be quite a common theme in this game's characters. What did the TOS say about H again?
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Now, let's talk about a topic that is a bit less gloomy, the Loporrits. I absolutely adore the way they tied the Loporrits into Urianger's character.
It is clear you have spared no effort. Why, your very names are a testament to your dedication.
Our names? I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at.
Names are an expression of the self, a declaration of one's hopes and aspirations. Your use of contemporary, uncomplicated nomenclature doth ensure clarity of purpose and living way. 'Tis no easy feat to convey the significance of thy moniker. When I was a bookish boy, a dear friend of mine was fond of peppering me with questions as I read, to my occasional annoyance. One day, I posed to her a question of mine own. What doth it mean to live? After much contemplation, she proffered this answer. The anticipation of a half-read story's conclusion. The hope today's mistake may serve as tomorrow's lesson. the wish that a new acquaintance may one day call thee friend. She believed it to be all these moments and more. I, too, still labor to find mine own answer. 'Twould be my pleasure to assist you and yours in embarking on a journey of self-discovery and enlightenment. And with that ink, let us fill the empty pages of Living Way's compendium. An open exchange of ideas will surely afford you all a better understanding of modern man, and with it, ideas for improvements and renovations. But more importantly, it shall empower us to together find a way forward. To accept failure is to accept the demise not only of our star, but that of Reen's, of all reflections, and the souls that call them home.
There are so many things I love about that scene. Urianger specifically mentioning Reen, showing how much he cared for her. Tancred's reaction to Urianger mentioning the significance of names is great, since a lot of Tancred's story revolves around names. He had given both Minfilia and Reen a name, as well as how Muzua gave him the surname Waters, each of these having their own significance behind them. The fact that Urianger referred to his past self as a bookish boy, indicating how he has grown as a character. How he brings up Moenbryda's view on life and the irony that he himself admits that he struggles to find an answer to the very question he posed. But most importantly, the way he addresses the Loporrits in this scene. His time dealing with the Feyfolk in Shadowbringers serves as a perfect prelude to his relation with the Loporrits in Endwalker.
Puddingway? Yes, indeed. A name of deep and abiding significance, I'm sure. But one perhaps better communicated through delicious deeds than tasteless words. A judicious application of Fey magics at a later juncture may be appropriate.
He gives them pep talks, shows a lot of wisdom in being able to peruse each and everyone's individuality and their strengths, shows quite a lot of compassion towards them. It's an incredibly good continuation of his character, which makes that story very wholesome. His foresight probably saved the day, as you are then able to effectively have the Loporrits communicate with the Sharlayans, owing to Urianger's interactions with them and being able to discern where each Loporrit is the most effective at addressing which issues. A really awesome moment which almost immediately follows into a scene that I can say with a great amount of confidence got most people. The encounter between Urianger and Moenbryda's parents. What a stellar scene, oh my god. What is particularly interesting about this one looking back is how early on it was telegraphed. At the start of the game, and I do mean literally the very start of the game, before you even take the boat to Sharlayan, there's a line of optional dialogue from Urianger, where he says he's dreading a certain unhad conversation. I remember being really hooked by this line because at this stage I didn't really think it would have been tied to Moenbryda. After all, it's Urianger, it's quite realistic to assume there's some great secret he's holding or that he's just being ominous or whatever. Shortly afterwards, in Sharlayan, he then tries to visit Moenbryda's parents but backed out last second because the prospect of having that convo was too daunting. I like how this is set up so early on into the Endwalker story, like the writers really be teasing you. This is of course on top of the fact that this loose thread had been just chilling there for like half a decade and 3 expansions, the thing I talked about at the start of this video, so it's really been having quite the build up both in a macro and a micro sense. So we have the build up, but what about the payoff? Well, you have probably seen it, and I don't need to tell you this, but yes, the payoff is off the bloody charts. The scene starts with a bit of tension because we aren't quite sure how the parents will react, but we then see that they were not just empathizing with Urianger, but were even proud of him. And Urianger's reaction, just the raw amount of emotion conceived brilliantly by Timothy Watson. It is no wonder that whenever I speak to people about Endwalker, this scene is universally loved by everyone, because the way Urianger carries himself in it is so real. He struggles to form cohesive thoughts. He isn't sure what to say, what he should do, if he should hug her back. I mean, you have to remember this from his perspective, right? He was genuinely afraid of confronting Moenbryda's parents because he wasn't sure of how they would react and indeed how he would react. Then it all sort of just happens and oh gosh, it's just so emotional. I also like how Tancred is witnessing this in the background as sort of a mirror to when Urianger was there to witness his own family matter in regards to Reen. I mentioned the hug and I want to emphasize that a bit more here. When you look at it without context, it may seem rather superficial to gush about the fact that there is a hug. I mean, duh, what a basic thing, yes, people hug each other all the time. But the reason it's so important in this scene is because of how rarely characters in this game actually hug each other. And Mr. Yoshida has commented on it before, stating that it's apparently difficult to have characters hug each other in cutscenes, the Warrior of Light in particular, because of their varying height. So the fact that they went through that extra effort really emphasizes how much care the developers put into this scene. In fact, we learned from interviews that this scene was one that Mr. Yoshida insisted on being added as a way to wrap up Urianger's character in the Zodiac/Heidelin story, and it definitely worked. I mentioned in my Alphino video how every character in Endwalker got their moment in their spotlight, where they get to contribute not just to the plot, but also display their character's growth on a more personal, micro level. For Alphino, it was his victory over the Forum, and him earning the respect of his father. For Estinian, it was his pep talk to Vitra and bridging the gap between man and dragon as Vitra comes clean about being the true leader of Rajat Han thanks to his encouragement. For Urianger, it was this moment. His ability to understand the Loporrits and organize them in helping the Sharlians, which followed into this beautiful scene that brings closure to Moenbryda. Urianger's story in this saga is then concluded quite nicely with him and Tancred lending their aid to the Sharlians and Loporrits in helping them repurposing the moon and ensuring that shady people don't interfere. To finish up my gushing session here, I loved how much character development we got for Urianger in Shadowbringers/Endwalker after he had been kind of absent in the previous expansions. He has some incredibly powerful scenes in those two expansions, and I appreciate how much we got to learn in terms of his mindset and how he views the world. He's a Chad mage with some really awesome moments. He has a cool dynamic with Tancred, and the writers make good use of this kind of nerdy/dorky side of him, especially in Endwalker, like when he shivers in Garle mode, or sees things in 2 for the first time at the last stand when he's kinda drunk. I like the Loporrits, and so I will like the character who befriends them, and last, but definitely not least, that immaculate scene with Moenbryda's parents. Honestly, I could have just had this video be me playing that scene, and that would have been enough, but you know, I like to dig deeper into this kind of stuff. Use many words where fewer would suffice, kinda like Urianger really. Well, we are more than halfway through discussing the Endwalker main cast. I got Grahatia and Alize lined up still. Please look forward to it, as they say. Dropping a sub is an easy way to stick around this channel for when I release those videos. Have a nice day.
It hath been some time. 'Tis good to see you in good health.
Likewise, old friend. Levida and I were most honored to answer the call. Never expected this reunion though, did we, dear?
I'll say, the nerve. Sending that letter, then running off to the gods know where. Do you have any idea how worried we were?
I'm sorry. 'Twas remiss of me. not to deliver the news in person. No, more than that. 'Twas I who...
Our daughter was disillusioned after Master Louisoix left her behind. The day the Scions called upon her was the happiest I'd seen her in years. She made her every choice of her own free will. No one could have ever forced her to do otherwise. Don't blame yourself for her death. Celebrate her life. You know that's what she'd want.
If there is one thing we resent you for, it was that we could not be there to mourn her with you. Reading the words you penned in that shaky hand, we must have cried as much for you as we did for her.
I'm sorry. I truly, truly am. I knew not what to say. Knew not how to express my feelings. The poems and platitudes of wiser men, musings on sadness and loss, studied and memorized, and meaningless in the moment.
Silly boy. We are all powerless before such grief. Even now, try as I might, the words escape me. But in our hearts, we know. We always know.
I remember when you were young, how the lads teased you for choosing the company of books over others. Our moon didn't take kindly to that. Be nice to Urianger, she'd shout, and give them a walloping. No matter how many times we scolded her.
So we offered a suggestion. Rather than starting fights, why don't you be the bridge between Urianger and the others? She had to mull it over for a while, arms crossed, brow furrowed in intense thought. But from that day on, she never let you be alone. She'd drag you outside to play, pepper you with endless questions, read the same books you read, all to try and understand you that much better. I'm sure it was annoying and exhausting at the time, but she only ever had the best of intentions.
And look at you now, at the center of the crowd. The reason there even is a crowd, having brought these people together. You've no idea how proud we are.
To see the boy, our daughter, trusted and believed in more than anyone, grow into the man she always knew he could be. I can see her in you too. Feel her. She walks with you wheresoever you go. So thank you, Urianger, for being who you are.
I think I can feel her too. The truth of her life. Not sorrow, but hope and love.
So, guess which scene I just watched? You know, even before this scene, I was already like, I was already like, God damn, Urianger really, they really did so much with him. The Fey folk in Shadowbringers were essentially a prelude to what he did here, basically. He, you know, with his relationship with the Loporrits here. It's just so wholesome, you know, like, he gives them pep talks, he teaches them about, you know, about life, makes them learn many things, shows his wisdom, and he shows a lot of wisdom in being able to peruse their individuality and what each of them are strong in, and yeah, I mean, as these characters pointed out here, his foresight probably did save the day here, because, you know, you had all of these Charlans who were distressed, and now they got some expertise, and it was pretty much thanks to Urianger that they were able to share it. So that already made me just love him as a character, but then his interaction where, especially when her father said that he's proud of what Urianger became. Oh man. Like at the start of the game, I was wondering if when he mentioned their parents before you go visit Davnir, he mentions Moenbryda's parents and how he hesitated to visit them when you first went to Charlian. And in fact, before you even depart to Charlian, he has a feeling of dread to visiting Charlian, because, you know, he knows that he might have to have this conversation. You know, after all that, I was kind of thinking like, I hope that goes somewhere, and oh my god, I'm so glad. Did it ever, basically. I couldn't have hoped for a better payoff than this. In the manner of like an hour, Urianger really, like, I already liked Urianger a lot after Shadowbringers, but he just jumped up to be, I don't know how many slots, but I mean, wow, he's definitely became, I definitely appreciate him even more now, so that's awesome.